Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's education segment for an industry perspective on supply chain, a topic that is certainly top of mind for all of us in the industry. I'm John Matron, Director of Real Estate and Facilities for Geico and Chapter President. To start, I'd like to thank our education chairs and volunteers for all the exciting and relevant programming. And as always, a special thank you to our sponsors for the continued support of the chapter. As a quick reminder for a few upcoming events, our next CRE Roundtable Dinner is May the 4th, a philanthropic event partnering with the Ronald McDonald House, May the 12th, and most notably, our Awards of Excellence Gala will be May the 18th, which we're excited to be hosting at Capital One Hall in Tysons. And without further delay, I'll introduce our panel. Mr. David Childress, Regional Co-Managing Director with Rand Construction. David has Jody Williams, Principal with Callison RTKL. Al Nielsen, Senior Vice President of Data Center Implementation with Capital Power Group and past President. And Megan Lance, Vice President of Research and Development with HIT and also Vice President of the chapter. Please feel free to drop questions in as we go through today's event. We'll be monitoring the chat, so anything comes up, feel free to drop them in and we'll do our best to try to get to them as we go through. And just as a reminder, please do keep cameras off and keep muted if you're not participating. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over here to David to get us going and get into the content.
All right, thanks, John. Appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and dig in. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate you joining us today. The supply chain has become a pretty broad topic. I would say Megan and I were talking the other day, and we've just started calling everything COVID. And so we thought it might be helpful to break down what's really going on, what we're seeing across the market, across the globe, really, at a macro level, and then a micro level, and then talk more about mitigation and where we're finding success. Getting through what has certainly been a challenge for the last couple of years. And sorry, John, and we don't see a real clear end in sight right now. So John had asked me to say that the end is coming, and I'm not sure that we're there yet. So why don't we start with kind of what we know, how we got here, and really confirm what we're hearing around the market. And maybe, Al, if you wanted to start us off and talk a little bit about what you're seeing from an owner's perspective and maybe some of the things that you can kind of confirm on your end, and then we'll work around the horn a little bit.
Yeah, sure, David, thanks. Hello, everyone. Just to give you a lens or perspective from the data center market, which is the market that I focus on, demand is probably no surprise. Demand is very strong for the data center market. The industry is busy really on all fronts, merely across the country, across the globe. And, coupled with market conditions, that's putting pressure on supply chain, which is really what we wanted to focus on today. We're seeing things that we haven't seen before. I mean, the market's been strong for some time, and now we're seeing particular lead times extended, but we've always had long lead equipment on large infrastructure projects, so that's not a surprise. What is a surprise, or recent developments, I should say, is that some of the commodities that this is expanding into are areas that we haven't seen, delays before or increased lead times before, which then turns into sort of costing exercises and pricing increases and what have you. But it varies. We've seen, our experience has been things like roof insulation to steel to PVC conduit, even lead times really are getting extended on some of these things, and even switches for network fiber switches. We've seen dramatic increases in lead times there that our customers are planning for, trying to get ahead of, but it continues to be just sort of an unusual or recent chain of events that's continuing to drive demand out. So just a bit of an unusual time in the market, and we're trying to get our arms around that and to react to how we would deliver for our projects going forward. So just wanted to provide a little overview of generally what we're hearing from that market segment.
What about you, Jody? What does it look like from a design perspective right now, and what are you trying to tackle the most?
That's a great question. So just for your guys' knowledge, I work primarily with multinational clients as well as the US federal government. I mean, we're in DC, how do you avoid it? But most of my clients on both sides, that both public and private, are looking for extreme certainty in cost and schedule well in advance of the project actually happening, which is certainly not something any one of us are feeling particularly comfortable about today. We're seeing a lot of frustration with schedule delays. A lot of that is tied to the money of, our lease is expiring in facility A, we need facility B to be ready. We can't extend the lease. We don't want to extend the lease. A lot of frustration around cost, which is not necessarily supply chain, but it's certainly all tied into what we're working with our clients. We're seeing challenges around additional services and change orders, no matter where we are in the design process, and a lack of understanding, particularly from the end users, not necessarily the real estate people, but the end users, of not really understanding the issues with construction, the issues with FF&E, and how they may or may not be related to each other in any given point in time. In terms of the designers, we feel an expectation from our clients to be not only a great designers and really knowledgeable about workplace, but also futurists and magicians that can just solve a problem any day. It's been particularly difficult for our design teams. We're typically very close to the clients, and we're asked to be advisors on just everything. And we struggle to stay on top of, what's happening with long lead items, why things are the way they are. We have a project right now that's in construction. It's about 70,000 square feet, and everything's, going along as it is. And all of a sudden we have a duct liner issue where duct liner A will come in 3 weeks and duct liner B will come in 23 weeks. And there's just no way of us understanding that. So we're trying to work with our clients a lot to help them identify long lead items, the ever-changing list of long lead items, and really thinking about value engineering right now.
I think one of the things you talked about a couple times there was getting an understanding of why. Like, we can all talk about the what, but the why seems to just, again, fall under the spanner of COVID. And I think that that's starting to get a little stale, and people are in a little bit of a state of disbelief. And maybe, Megan, you could, I know your team has done extensive kind of data mining on this and research. Maybe you could walk us through some of the actual facts, the whys, that we could dig into a little bit more.
Sure. Thank you. So for those that don't know me, I lead our research and development at HIT. And we have a team that's really focused on a lot of the research, data analytics, insights that David mentioned. I'm actually going to share my screen really quick. We did a deep dive earlier in the year, really starting last year into the beginning of this year, around answering exactly that, like, what is the problem? Why is this happening? And what can we do to fix it? Let me share this really quick. All right. So I can be totally honest with you. I could geek out on this data all day long. I'm going to not do that. I'm going to take no more than 5 minutes to just kind of explain some context. I will say that we actually have like a 50-page report. I'm only going to show like 6 slides so that no one's asleep at the end of this. So really quick, I think David mentioned this, but even before COVID, does everyone remember when tariffs were happening and this was something that we were hyper focused on? How is this impacting costs? What are we going to do? And really kind of continually looking at how this impacts our work. And then COVID happened. And if you think about even just the impact of COVID, it really shut down the US and the world for an extended period of time, which really caused manufacturing to stop. It caused shipping and logistics issues. There were a lot of layoffs that kind of rippled through both our market and global markets. And then just as quickly as we fell downward, we also picked back up. And we weren't able to, as an economy, really scale those jobs back up as fast as we needed to in order to receive all of the shipments coming in from the ports, and then actually get trucks to deliver them to the actual job sites or even to our homes. So that certainly the shutdown impacted things. Then in February, we had the big winter storm in Southeast Texas. I'm not sure if everyone remembers that. It wreaked havoc on the power grid. It paused a lot of the semiconductors and gas refineries. It actually impacted our work more than I think people realized. Like the fleck that goes into the paint wasn't able to be produced for an extended period of time. I know that there were people bartering outside Sherwin-Williams just to get paint for them to be able to, temporarily fix their space before moving in. I think from there, then we had Hurricane Ida, another natural disaster that was not planned for or really anticipated, which again, continued to put additional strains on supply chain. And I think in fall 2021, we had a lot of panic buying. There was a lot going out there. A lot of us were still home. I'm sure everyone remembers how crazy the toilet paper and Clorox, Lysol shortage was, and how hard we were working to get as much as we could. And when you do that, it actually makes our supply chain challenges even harder. The same thing happens, on the construction side. We can certainly talk about later on the program how all of these have impacted what we're doing. I will say there's actually 2 more in 2022 that are not on this list yet and will be out in our Q1 report. And that is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. There's no doubt that that's, you take out COVID, you could put in Russia-Ukraine. That's certainly having an impact on what we're dealing with today. And then also, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with COVID's zero COVID mandate. They halted a lot of manufacturing for weeks. They're already seeing that impact in their Q1 GDP, not really meeting what they expected. And again, now that they're, trying to get back to normal operations, that's going to flood the ports again. And we already don't have the logistics. It's truly, I'll try to make this the only negative slide, that it's like so many black swan events that we couldn't prepare for. It is not just COVID. This is way more, way deeper than COVID. Certainly COVID didn't help, but we're seeing these things continue, and we're trying to figure out how do we actually come up with solutions that really improve the supply chain and that fracturing of the supply chain instead of, waiting for the events necessarily to go away. All right, another thing that that certainly has impacted really the market is really around labor. Prior to the pandemic, construction had a challenge with workforce, right? We had a big issue with labor. The pandemic made that exacerbated. A lot of people across the industry that were close to retirement or maybe wanted to shift careers, they were like, we're out, let's do something different. And I think that we're seeing that. If you look at a lot of our numbers, we're not hiring. We don't have enough candidates to hire to even fill the positions. When you look at this graph over here on the right, if you look at the earlier years where there's the gap between openings and hires, we like to see that because there's candidates in the pool, there's choices that helps really normalize the cost, kind of everything across the board. When we're really compressed, it's a real challenge. We have the same war for talent really that every other industry has. And frankly, if we hired everybody coming out of school, we probably still wouldn't have enough to really impact the challenges we've seen with labor. Then, of course, if you're having issues with labor, that certainly leads to costs. So I wouldn't say that we certainly have seen an increase in the cost of labor, but it's not as dramatic as maybe what we've seen on even the material side of things. But this is something that we certainly continue to track and monitor and understand where this is and how that actually is impacting down the line. One thing I would highlight here, this is really looking at final demand. So what is the actual cost at the end of the day for a product or project? And if you look over on the left-hand side, we call out the 3.8% increase in the labor cost in construction. There's also a 34.9% year-over-year increase in just the construction materials cost. And that's general across the whole landscape. We go in later to breaking down different materials and how those arrange. Everyone remembers lumber being, continuing to be an issue, gypsum, steel, kind of all the raw materials. But if you look at the actual final demand, it has showed that our cost, our final cost is up about 12.4%. What that is showing is that a lot of the bid prices are starting to normalize out with where the supply chain is actually absorbing a lot of that cost. And so we don't want to see that number continue to rise. And we may have to look at different ways to build and do things in order to try to normalize that number. And then lead times. This is something that, I would say is pretty dramatic, the number of weeks of lead times. If you just think about roofing, to go from 4 weeks to 40 weeks, that's adding 9 months to a job. Even if you look at gypsum having a 14-week lead time, a lot of our interiors jobs are done within 14 weeks. So if you think about how that changes your overall landscape of procuring materials, planning for your projects, understanding when those things move, this is, I will say, is very dynamic. We do update this monthly, and we pull all of our team members and our subcontractors to keep this as active as we can. But I wouldn't say that they're dramatically getting shorter. And it seems like where one gets shorter, another that we hadn't anticipated starts to get longer. But this is something that we're certainly keeping a lot of track on. I'm going to show just one quick visual. So I think the one thing that I know we'll get to here is that when we talk about material lead times and really overall supply chain, we are kind of out of the big picture topics and into individual components. If you look at this roofing assembly, this is a detail from one of our projects, you can see that it's not just the roof, it's every individual piece has a different lead time. And so that is really, much to Jody's point earlier, that's really challenging in trying to manage how long is it going to take for us to actually get to the job site, and how do we work to ensure that we can expedite or manage the process as best we can to be predictable and when these actually arrive. So you're going to hear us talk a lot about components as we get further along. So just keep that in mind, that when we get down into the individual layers, it's more than just the roof or steel. We have to actually get down into literally the nuts and bolts. I'm going to stop there.
I mean, I think that's such a great example of, as we talk with our clients and we talk with each other about projects, we talk about roofs, we talk about walls, we talk about floors. We kind of lose sight of the components a lot of times. And, what's the use of having part of your roof assembly if you can't get the adhesive, or if you can't get, so these components are putting the brakes on a lot of the things that we're doing. And it's the little things that you talked about. Paint fleck. I think the other one, we were dealing with a few weeks ago is we couldn't get glue. We just couldn't get glue. When the petroleum shortages happened because of the freeze in Texas, you couldn't get terrazzo and many other petroleum-based elements. So I think that helping folks understand that all of the elements that go into what we would classify as one thing, like a roof, when you break them out into their pieces, each piece is fragile in its supply chain and sourcing. John asked a question here. I'll pause for a second. Does value engineering concept go away and focus exclusively on lead times and supply chain? It would be great if that were the case, but there are very few clients that are willing to just say, we'll go and focus on our schedule and not on our budget. And that's been, I think, Jody, to your point, the biggest design challenge. Maybe you can speak about that a little bit, but if we try to focus on one element, there are other components we have to think about.
Yeah, it's funny. I had written that down for one of my points, was that one of the things that we need to be better about at project inception. So when we're, first starting to talk about business cases for our clients to go ahead and make a move or change a space, we need to be clear with the deciders. Well, number one, who the deciders are, but number two, what are the goals? Is the goal budget? Is it schedule? Is it design quality? Is it something else? And all being clear on what is the most important and what are we willing to compromise on. And I find a lot of clients don't want to compromise on anything. So we as design professionals, as a professional organization, professional group, need to work together. And the projects where we're most successful is where all the consultants are working together to say, hey, no, this is reality. We would absolutely love to be magicians for you, but we can't. So A, B, or C, or A and C. And when we get that, we're much more successful. But I mean, to David's point, a lot of it all comes down to, we have set aside X many dollars in our capital budget, and that's all we have, and you have to spend it this year, and that's the end.
Al, what about you? Do you have any other thoughts on that, maybe as it relates to, and it kind of leads us into this discussion where we were headed, which is actually time and money, right? So you can't necessarily pick one, but you almost have to. How do you look at that, and how do you advise your clients in that regard?
In terms of mitigation, David, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, right. So if you don't have an opportunity to value engineer, or if you need to focus on value engineering because your budget's out of line, but schedule's critical, what are you typically talking to your clients about?
We've looked, one of the methods, if you will, that we have dialogue around is alternatives and substitutions, that could generate some other options for us in terms of lead times, potentially price as well. To the extent that clients are open to that sort of those considerations, I think it's incumbent upon us to bring them up. While it may not be a preferred option, there could be an alternative substitution that could meet the design intent, albeit perhaps not the preferred manufacturer. So that's another lever in this dynamic that we have to explore. It's not always a great option, but I think it's important that we're bringing options forward.
Yeah, and performance-based specs is part of that too, instead of being more prescriptive, giving some more leeway there.
Oh, I would totally agree. I mean, so dialing back just a second, and I'll get to that question actually that Hank wrote, what are some other mitigation strategies? We're headed directly there. I think it's important. So Megan, you put like 50 slides worth of data into 5 for us. What's your general takeaway in terms of what all of these components mean in terms of budget and schedule? If you had to sum a lot of that data up, what's the big bullet point there?
Oh, it's complicated. I'm like, do I go with it's complicated or it depends? I mean, I feel like those are the two non-answers that I think often come up here. I think for me,
well, I'll get more direct.
No, I'll get into it.
How much does this mean?
Yeah, right. I think one of the challenges we're faced with is really over the last I would say 18 to 24 months, really with, if you just take the pandemic aspect and really how much that really jostled what we're doing. I really believe that a lot of the supply chain from the manufacturers through shipping and logistics all the way to contractors and trade partners have absorbed some of those cost increases, which is why you're seeing a difference between that final demand number and what the raw material cost of the labor cost increase is. I certainly have concerns that could continue to normalize and increase. And so I think we need to be really mindful of that. I think from a budget perspective, we are seeing trade partners, hold pricing for a week. So I think for me, like from a timing and a budget perspective, and I know we're going to get to this later on, the biggest thing that I could preach is early engagement of your partners, like well before you even considering moving, just to understand the environment and the dynamic and maybe what be happening, and be as nimble as possible when you're trying to make these decisions, and try to build in, flexibility where you can. I think though, like when we look at longer term solutions, Al certainly hit the nail on the head around, like, we need to look at alternative materials that aren't even in the construction space today, but that could be possible materials that we could be utilizing as a substitute to the kind of longstanding traditional materials that are driving up that cost and really, really impacting how long it takes to actually get it to the job site.
I think the material question is a strong one. So Jody, on that topic of mitigating from the design start, you really are kind of the tip of the spear. When you're working with clients in your early programming and schematic, what are you finding in the last 18 months to be successful in trying to mitigate some of these impacts?
So I think to Megan's point, making decisions quickly and being able to move quickly. Think about it like the housing market. You find the perfect house, you put the offer in that day. You don't pause and think about it for a week. You just do it. And I think that the real estate teams really understand that, but we need to do more education with our clients at the executive decision-making level A lot of times they don't have full understanding of exactly what's going on and why it's important. So having more kind of executive briefing level material to say, these are some of the risks that are going to happen. They're not the same as what you did 5 years ago on every other project. The other is working with procurement, that helping them understand why decisions are made and why they're important, that the bottom dollar is not always the right way to make a choice. So I think there's education there. I have one client where very recently they got, I don't know, 3 or 4 bids for furniture, and the procurement manager decided that he wanted to buy the cheapest furniture item from each vendor. So chairs from, it would have been a nightmare. It worked supply chain wise in terms of delivery, but you all know what a mess that would be managing, both short term and long term. And then the other part, I think, is educating the actual end users, the people, the stakeholders who are going to sit in the seats, who really only care about their office move once every 5 to 10 years, helping set expectations with them, giving them clear goals, helping them understand decision-making points. It can definitely be challenging, but I think it's something we need to all invest more time and energy doing.
I think your point about educating all the way up the decision chain is so important, because what's important to the team on the ground level may not actually be important to the person making the final call. They may not realize that, if costs are trending up, waiting to make a decision is not typically going to bring costs back down, right? I think that's been a big challenge. As we looked at it from a contractor perspective, you talk about early engagement, now can probably pile onto this, but I look at not just early general contractor engagement, and that's not just a shameless plug. If we're sitting at the table with Jody and Al together talking about decisions that need to be made and how to make them, I think we can help our clients make better decisions, but also taking it one step further and looking at sub-selection and actually considering bringing on a sub as a partner, just like you would as an architect or a contractor, and saying, look, we're going to lock in with these folks as well and use their expertise to help drive in better cost and better timeline decisions. I think that's it's not normal, especially in my world of interiors, right? To bring subs on early and engage them early. It happens a little more maybe in a base building and development world. But I think if we're going to think differently about how to get our clients to a successful delivery, doing it early, to your point, and then being willing to actually engage farther down the food chain to make good decisions, I think is critical. I'm sure, Al, you and your teams are looking at similar decision processes and engagement. Where else are you seeing big mitigation opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good subject. I mean, it's sort of translating what we're seeing into the market into sort of plain terms for clients and projects that we're working on, and giving good examples of where we're seeing pressure on that delivery process. But just in general, I think the timelines that we're seeing, a project that might have taken 12 months previously is probably looking at 14 to 15, 16 months now. That's not unusual. And if it takes longer to construct, it's likely going to be more expensive as well. So you're mobilized on a project for a longer duration. So it's really those two things. And I think clients are starting to ask. Some of those clients are starting to ask the question. They're coming to, we're hearing in the market, like, what are you seeing in terms of lead times and cost? What's your sense? If a project came up this year, what does that timeline look like for delivery? And so I think, it's been out there in the market for, let's call it 6 months now, where things have really started to materialize to some of these differences. And I think we're getting better about responding to and answering those questions and coming up with those mitigation plans. So, mitigation can take many forms, but, getting on board early, or to the extent you can release early packages, early release packages through your process. And, in some cases, production runs, lock in the production run, even if you don't have your design complete. Work with, if it's a commodity like steel and you don't have your design done, oftentimes you can get a production slot while you're finalizing your design. So those are some of the things that you can do sort of on the front end to mitigate some of the longer lead delivery timelines that we're seeing. It doesn't work in all commodities, but certainly in some it will. But that's a good example. I touched on the network service switches, fiber switches earlier. Those lead times are something like 12 months now, and that's partly chip related. Chips in general are an issue, and at least where we don't often touch that component unless it's something embedded in a piece of long lead equipment. But for fiber switches, 12 months. It's just you never know where the next blockade or truncated lead time might come from. Would be a way to say that. So yeah, I think the extent that you can get production slots, early release packages, and really getting creative on what those release packages could be, and obviously finalizing long lead equipment specs so that you can go out and begin the same thing and let them get their production runs booked, so you can work on the commodities end of it once you've got your production slot secured. Those are all aspects that we're pursuing and trying to mitigate some of these lead times, get in front of them.
Yeah, one of the other things that
Jody-
we're seeing is more emphasis on reusing materials. So frequently when we'll be doing a tenant renovation, tenant improvement, renovate in place, we'll see what can be reused. It's great when we can get a GC or a CM on board early to help with that. But we're seeing our clients be a lot more interested in that from a cost perspective, from a sustainability perspective, and from the fact that it's here and our time is limited. So I think that greater focus on that in the beginning of a project, what can we reuse and what are the pros and cons of reusing it? Can we trade with our other office that's that's changing in 6 months? What are the positive impacts? What are the negative impacts? And how can those be balanced to hit that goal that we've established, whether it be schedule, budget, fancy design, whatever. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's a market that, if we're thinking about circularity and circular economy, it's a market that's not as robust as we would all love it to be, but I see the beginnings of that really taking off.
Al talks about early release, and we love to throw that buzzword around, right? Early release this and that. Really, and what we really mean is, we might cut loose a couple pieces of equipment. And Jody, I wonder from your perspective, because when I'm talking about early release now in this environment, I need fragmented design. I need you to design element A, B, and C before you're ever through DDs, and give me something that I can go buy. Does that cause you to look at the way you price and plan your work differently? And how does that conversation sound inside a design shop? And when you're saying, look, I can't even finish my detailing because these guys want to go buy the mountables tomorrow.
Yes, that is exactly what's happening. In terms of our pricing for our services, it generally hasn't impacted that too much, depending on how the packages are broken out. Certainly, if we have to submit various different things for different permitting times and how that all works, that impacts our overall design fees. But if we're doing, say, and I work a lot with a couple of clients that have in-house, or not in-house, but cost estimating for partner firms, and being on board with them from the minute we start laying out a program, laying out a test fit, looking at that, starting to get an idea for how much steel we're going to need, how much drywall we need, and starting those things early. And again, educating the client on, okay, you bought off on this space plan. That means we can order these things, but if you change it, there's a risk. So again, it's that whole conversation about what are you willing to hold firm and be the decider and really keep the end users and the executives at bay and say, no, we wanted to do this fast. We wanted to do it as inexpensively as possible. And this is the decision we made, and we're going to live with it. So that's where the risk tends to come in for us, because we're doing a package now where we're on our second addendum because no one can say no on the client side. And that's a real challenge to everybody, the design team, the GC, the subs. You just don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay, one thing
We're in a job
I
right now. Oh, go ahead, Megan. Yeah.
no, I was just going to add. So I certainly love early engagement, early procurement. Anything we can do to do that is certainly really productive. The one thing that I'd love to kind of pose to our group here, and I know we chatted about this prior, is oftentimes, and I'd say more often than not, we're finding out like the week before that something's not going to arrive to the job, right? So it's certainly, we can plan all of that early procurement. We can try to procure as much as we can. We can certainly, travel to the facility and physically lay eyes on what's being produced. But still, sometimes there's those components or parts or pieces that are supposed to be on the job site next week, and you've got everybody lined up, and they call and say, actually, we're like another 4 to 6 weeks behind. And then I think it's that, like, quick solutions, even if it's temporary, even though we know we don't like temporary, but like trying to come up with that game plan at that time.
Well, I think now more than ever, we can help our clients stop raising an eyebrow at why jobs need contingency. If suddenly a countertop's not going to show up and we need to go buy 20 PLAM countertops and throw them in to get final inspections, that's a decision we want to make together, because no matter how many times, to your point, Megan, no matter how many times you call the supplier and call the contractor and check the supply house and everything's fine, suddenly it's not. And then what do you do? So I think that flexibility has been, and being willing to think on our feet and kind of solve problems together with the client has been a big mitigation strategy. It's not linear anymore. I think that's a huge part of the process. And I had one other point. We have a project right now where I think we're driving our design partners nuts, but we've got the client on board. We are not even through DD. We're releasing a light fixture package. We're going to buy the light fixtures. We're just going to go buy them. Even if there's too many or too few, we're just going to go buy them all. And we're releasing a stair that hasn't been designed. We've got a rendering and we've got a materials list, and we're going to go buy it, design, build, and we're going to get that stair in production. And we're going to buy demountables. We made the client sign off on the floor plan, and they said, look, our layout's not changing. We're buying demountables. So being willing to get your team to say, okay, we're ready to spend the money. Everybody agrees this is a mitigation strategy. The design is not done. We know there might be something funky that happens in 6 months that we're all going to have to work on together. But we've taken big chunks of risk out of the job and what I would say from an interiors perspective is pretty unconventional. We don't, we lean forward a little bit, but we don't typically buy all these things before the design's actually complete. I think that I would say that we haven't gotten the job built, but I'd say that's a successful start where the whole team is understanding where we're headed and they're willing to commit to a little bit of, Megan, you had said this before, a little bit of a shared risk model, right? Nobody likes that. Everybody wants to move the risk down the line. And I think we need to be willing to accept that we all need to kind of share in this for the foreseeable future to figure it out. We've got about 5 more minutes before we were going to stop for Q&A. I thought maybe I would just go around the horn and say, if there was one thing that you wanted this group, this audience to take away from your perspective and seat you sit in, what would that thing be? And maybe we'll start with you, Al.
I have one thing. I have a few things.
If you had 5 things that you wanted everyone to walk away from this with.
Yeah, no, I think, for me, probably the biggest is, manage a client's expectation, manage the owner's expectation. I think it's important to have those the dialogue around, timelines of delivery and cost associated with delivery, sort of get that out there, make sure it's clear so that those clients can prepare and they can manage up their leadership chain to say, look at that project that took 8 months in the past. It's probably a 12-month delivery timeline. Let them have those conversations, give them the tools to help them support their delivery model. And I think, it's incumbent upon sort of the industry to help the clients do that. So that's probably the big one. There was another point I just wanted to touch on, and this is one, it's a little more in the weeds, but I think it's a good one just to make sure people understand. and Megan, I think you leaned into this earlier, which is, bid prices. People, used to be able to get a bid and a proposal and package it up and give it to a customer, and they could take run through their process and come back. And by the time that normal cycle time, that decision gets made, you go back to your trade partners and subs, and the prices have gone up. Like, they've only held the prices for 7 days. And, and we are seeing that. That's a fairly common technique that's being used now because of the instability in the price chain. And so, you talk about the timelines and managing clients' expectation. Don't hesitate. Hesitation, is going to cause potentially a ripple effect in that delivery model. So that's another key point. Just sort of manage expectations of the client and make decisions quickly. That's probably the two key things I would say.
What about you, Jody?
So I think this is generally true, just as a general operating principle, is we need to always play as a team and always be team project and looking out for the best way. David, I think you said something really nice about the shared risk and being willing to take that on and not pass the buck down the line. And I think that a lot of that can be accomplished through, earlier engagement where possible, but also just clear, open, honest communication, keeping everybody in the same room together as much as possible, the same Zoom room together as much as possible. I think that's huge. And then the other thing that I think has been a really good lesson from COVID, this is a really positive out of COVID, is that even when our clients are, hitting a schedule point where they have to get out of one space and the next space is not ready, they know how to work remotely, right? They can do it. And generally speaking, there's not a lot of fuss around it from the actual employees. So I think the lesson there is that our clients are actually more flexible than they think they are. So keep that in mind. There are lots of positives, and people are generally very willing, as long as they understand what's going on and why.
Megan?
Sure. I'm like Al, I'm gonna try to narrow it down. I think, I'll certainly echo what he said on the speed for decision-making, nimble. I think a lot of our organizations, like, we all have red tape, we all have processes we need to go through, but now is a time that we probably need to relook at those and see what we can take out and manage those decisions much faster and just be as agile as possible, kind of moving through the overall construction. I think for the two things that I would say on the R&D side, which is really a lot of what our team focuses on, is first, think about, when you can, trying to not have every single project be 100% bespoke. And when we can look at repeatable components, that provides an opportunity for scalability and truly could be a solution to the supply chain. I'm certainly not a proponent of saying that every single person's office should look the same, but there's likely a way that we could get to 75, 80% somewhat standardized around the components that are being used, and then maybe a little bit less custom. I think the more custom that we get, 100% custom, is going to be more expensive and longer. I think the other piece that I would harp on from a R&D perspective is, certainly I recognize our R&D efforts are a long-term solution. They're not a short-term mitigation strategy to supply chain. It's much longer term. We are spending the time to research composite materials and how that might be an alternative to steel or concrete. We're looking at, really truly, how do we disrupt the cost? Is it 3D printing? Is it prefabrication? All of these things we're exploring and, are testing, ideating, trying here at the lab to try to come up with a way to build it in a shorter period of time, more reliably, and at a lesser cost. The one thing that I will say keeps me up at night is, if you look at over the last 30, 40 years, there really hasn't been a major cost disruption across our landscape. And so, when you think about the increases we've seen, it does give me pause. Is this a short-term increase that we've seen because of all of those unprecedented events that just happened to happen in a row? Or is this the cost that's going to be around to stay, and something that we need to manage to, and more than anything, disrupt ourselves by looking at new ways of doing what we do to truly be the longer term solution to that fractured fragmented, fragile supply chain?
That's a really interesting question of not just do we deliver projects the same way that we used to sometime down the road, but does the cost ever come back? And I'm not sure we're ready to answer that, but it's been one
It
on my
has
mind
to.
too. Like
It has to.
cost typically doesn't come back down, right? It only historically keeps going up, right? You hit a benchmark and then you go higher. But I think for me, my message is a little squishier, which is, you know, the old model of we're just going to issue an RFP, we're going to give you an end date, and we're going to slap some LDs on it. From a contractor's perspective, we've been fine with that for, you know, since the beginning of time. This isn't a normal kind of operating time that we're in, and I think that there needs to be some dual transparency. We need to convey with full transparency to the client what the constraints are, what we can do, what we can't do. We also need to hear from the client, the design team, from everybody, what's really important. Is that a real end date or is that a hopeful end date? Where are you flexible? Where can we, if we had to have a plan B and a plan C, where can you live with that? And you know, what's acceptable to you? Because we can make really good plans together. We can, but if we're in a vacuum, you know, and we're just charging for a date, the end product usually is not something everybody's too happy with. So I think that being able to operate with a kind of new level of transparency, and some clients and teams do, but if you can do that a little more across the board, I think everybody's a little more satisfied at the end of the day, delivering the job together. So that's kind of my, you know, softer side of things takeaway. Just so many times we hold our cards so close, and then, you know, we wind up talking right past each other. So I would say we can open it up. We've got a few minutes left to any questions. Some questions have been coming through the chat. But if anybody has something, you can type it in the chat, or if you want to just unmute at the risk of causing chaos.
I am
we
going
can do that
to,
too.
just for reference, I'm going to drop in the chat the link to the full report in case you want to read it all. And anyone that wants to have a separate
It's
session
long.
and dig in, let's do it.
It is a really good report, though. So props to your team for putting that together. So, John, is manufacturing changing to be more flexible and ramping up? I think, Megan, you would probably have to start on that side. You probably have a better gauge on manufacturing
Yeah,
than any of us.
I would say it's maturing, it's getting there. I mean, I think we talk a lot about and really ideate here around like, what does the industry 4.0 look like? How does all of the impacts, if you looked at the automobile industry, how much that has transformed over time, how does that potentially parlay at all into real estate or development? You know, I think going back to that part around bespoke versus repeatable, that is an area that we need to get more comfortable with to understand what level that is. I think that is one of our larger challenges on the manufacturing side, is being able, the more you can repeat a product, the more that it's going to be available and easier to achieve and get. But I would say that, is it more flexible? I definitely think it's getting there. And if you look at a lot of the VC, a lot of it is really diving into those facilities and trying to find a way to really increase them. One thing that, you know, I'll mention, Lavette on our team, who really put together that report, her and I were chatting the other day. And one thing that I thought was interesting that I personally didn't have a lot of visibility into is, if you think about all the ports and a lot of the challenges to actually even just getting the materials into the States and around the country, you know, on average, there's over 100 ships waiting to get in, right? And it takes a very long time for that to happen. I didn't even throw the ship up there that was stuck in the Suez Canal. That was another issue. You know, when you think about that, like when you think about the ports, a lot of those are more local government driven, not necessarily federal. And so trying to figure out, like, how does the infrastructure bill even come in to trying to maybe impact this in a positive way longer term as well. I don't know if I answered your question, John, but Al, Jody, David, chime in if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what we've seen so far, I appreciate your point about things maturing, but I'm not sure people have really adapted. I think they've just tried to accelerate. I'm not sure that people have retooled their plants to do things necessarily differently. They've just tried to do it faster and work longer hours. So from what I've seen so far, and I think that you're right, there has to be some sort of an overhaul in the way that we do things before we actually see a real change. Because right now we're just working people, as long and hard as they'll work. That's not sustainable. You can't work folks
Yeah.
7 days a week.
And I would
Just
just
not a
add that, sorry, David, I would just add that, oftentimes we'll be able to secure a production slot from those manufacturers. But they have so many items in the supply chain to support that production, and they don't know what the supply chain timeline might be for every product. When I say they don't know, it is somewhat unpredictable, meaning that where the next challenge is going to come in that supply chain is really, it's very sort of real time, and the delays happen pretty quickly. And so that's what we're sort of the feedback I've heard from manufacturers we're working with. So production slots we can get, but their supply chain downstream from that to actually manufacture the product is oftentimes the long pole in the tent, and it could be just some odd commodity or a one-off commodity that has a lead time that doesn't support the production slot. So it's that simple.
Stops the whole show. That's right. Any other questions? We've got a couple minutes left, but we're running a little ahead of schedule, so that's good. All right.
That's good for this group.
Well, I would say if that's it, then we can wrap up. Really, really appreciate everybody coming in. Hopefully you took something away that's going to be helpful and applicable immediately. I know we're all running hard and we're trying to deliver a lot of things, and hopefully some of these thoughts, conversations spark some ideas and were helpful. So thanks everybody for joining.